Hi, everyone, and welcome to STAT's virtual event, The Evolving Landscape for Biosimilars, sponsored by Samsung Bioepis. And thanks for joining us. My name is Ed Silverman. I'm a senior writer and PharmaLot columnist at STAT. Before we get started, though, a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Please use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team. This appears as STAT events. Please don't put your questions for us in the chat space. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask us during the event, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we'll try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and vote for the questions you would most like to see answered. We'll be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit whatever's on your mind. This is part of what makes the events fun. And thanks again to all of you for being here. Before we get started, though, I would like to welcome Sang-Jin Pak, Executive Vice President and leader of the commercial division at Samsung Bioepis, for a recorded sponsored introduction of today's event. So Sang-Jin, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ed, for having us today. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly reshaped the pharmaceutical industry. While we have witnessed some of the greatest scientific achievements in the history of mankind, the fastest development and approval of vaccines, we are also faced with the growing financial burden on healthcare, as the pandemic will remain with us for a while as more and more COVID-19 variants are evolving. And in the US, there's the issue of rising cost of medicines, which is another big burden for the US healthcare system. Thank you, Ed, for having us today. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly reshaped the pharmaceutical industry. While we have witnessed some of the greatest scientific achievements in the history of mankind, the fastest development and approval of vaccines, we are also faced with the growing financial burden on healthcare, as the pandemic will remain with us for a while as more and more COVID-19 variants are evolving. And in the US, there's the issue of rising cost of medicines, which is another big burden for the US healthcare system. Prescription drugs, biologics development. Thank you, Ed, for having us today. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly reshaped the pharmaceutical industry. While we have witnessed some of the greatest scientific achievements in the history of mankind, the fastest development and approval of vaccines, we are also faced with the growing financial burden on healthcare, as the pandemic will remain with us for a while as more and more COVID-19 variants are evolving. And in the US, there's the issue of rising cost of medicines, which is another big burden for the US healthcare system. Among the prescription drugs, biologics account for 37% of the US healthcare spending, while they only account for 2% of all prescriptions in the US. Biosimilar medicines, which are biological medicines that are highly similar to and have no clinically meaningful difference from the existing reference products, are approved through a different regulatory pathway, allowing them to be provided to patients at a potentially lower cost. For the market to function efficiently and grow in a healthy way after expiry of the patents, it's natural that we bring more products into the market, which will help lower the cost of biologics and expand access. The potential for biologics and expand Thank you, Ed, for having us today. Biosimilars to drive down costs, support access to treatment, and improve the sustainability of the healthcare system can be seen as an important lever in facilitating innovation in novel biologics, opening up more options due to the complexity of the market system, which is now evolving and improving to allow more biosimilars to gain access. One of the first biosimilar entrants was Infliximab, which is a medical benefit medicine used to treat certain types of arthritis affected. Let's admit that. However, more recent launches of trastuzumab, bevacizumab, to treatment, and improve the sustainability of the healthcare system can be seen as an important lever in facilitating innovation in novel biologics, opening up more options for patients. We believe that a wider use of biosimilars will create more headroom for the next wave of innovation. Since the first biosimilars entry into the US market, it has been a difficult journey for biosimilars to find their way to patients, partly due to the complexity of the market system, which is now evolving and improving to allow more biosimilars to gain access. One of the first biosimilar entrants was Infliximab, which is a medical benefit medicine used to treat certain types of arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease. In the US, the uptake of Infliximab has been a little bit slower than expected. Let's admit that. However, more recent launches of trastuzumab, bevacizumab, and rituximab in the oncology space indicates that stakeholders' confidence is growing and biosimilars are becoming more widely accepted, reaching about 60% of volume share by the end of the second year on the market. Samsung Bioepis, as a biopharmaceutical company whose core business is in biosimilar development, believes that biosimilars have a potential to give more benefits to patients by creating market competition and offering access at lower cost. We have gained approval for 5 products so far in the US: Infliximab, trastuzumab, etanercept, adalimumab, and most recently, ranibizumab biosimilar. We strongly believe that as more biosimilars reach the market, more patients can benefit from these valuable FDA-approved additional treatment options. We are very optimistic about the future of biosimilars and we are prepared and ready to play an important role in providing high-quality biologic medicines for the patients. We certainly want to play our part to help eliminate any barriers which may create misperception, misunderstanding, or hinder access, and we believe this can be done by education. I look forward to hearing great insights from biosimilar experts through this STAT conversation. Thank you so much, and back to you, Ed.
Well, hello, everyone, and sorry about the technical difficulties. These things happen sometimes, right? We live online. So let's get to it. We have three people here today who have a great deal of insight into biosimilars, and I'd like to welcome each of them right now. Madeline Feldman, president of the Coalition of State Rheumatology Organizations and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Tulane University School of Medicine. Sonia Oskry, VP, Vice President, Biosimilars at Cardinal Health, and Jillian Woollett, Principal Research Scientist at Avalier Health, the consulting firm. I'm going to kind of condense my opening remarks here and just sort of get to it right away. For those who haven't kept track, there have been 33 biosimilars approved in the United States since 2015, including 3 insulins, but only 24 of those biosimilars have made it to market so far, competing against 9 biologics. Why? Well, there are various factors that have influenced biosimilar adoption or the lack thereof. This includes wariness among physicians and patients who are concerned about the sameness, if you will, the similarities between different medicines, aggressive contracting by the innovative or brand name drug companies, the unclear savings to providers and insurers, and the lack of interchangeability, which of course is a regulatory issue as well. A couple of quick pieces of data. Total biosimilar sales on a wholesale basis year to date in 2021 have been about $9.6 billion. That compares with $9.4 billion in all of last year, 2020, and $5 billion in 2019. That's a September 17th. This from one of the brokerage firms citing IQVIA list price data. A couple of interesting developments. Neulasta, total biosimilar penetration is now up to almost 41%. Herceptin, total biosimilar penetration in the marketplace in the US is at nearly 63%. So there are signs that biosimilar adoption is increasing, but there's still lots of questions about why we're not seeing more of that happen faster, what can be done to make that work, how long will it take, and what needs to be done by who for the success to be reached. So I'd like to ask my panelists to help us answer those questions. So Jillian, start with you. What is, without going, of course, into everything all at once, because we want to cover some different points as we go along here during our conversation, but what do you see, Jillian, as the biggest impediment so far to biosimilar adoption? What has been the biggest hurdle, and where do you think that it went wrong?
I don't know about going wrong. I think the science is absolutely asked and answered. I think that was well established with how FDA had led the world with comparability back in 1996. But I think we were perhaps excessive in our caution about the amount of data that we got to get the initial approvals. And then we did fight a semantic issue. You will all remember everybody said biosimilar means similar and not the same. So my early suggestion was let's call them biosames, because the issue is not the name, but it allowed a perception that the products were at some level different. And that led to misinformation. And I think this is critically important because we're living now with the need for biosimilars to demonstrate something that the originators themselves don't demonstrate when they make major manufacturing changes. And I think the biggest step forward we can take at this point is to apply science and regulatory science in particular consistently to all biologics. So it's not just an education thing. The education is important, But the fact that the originators are essentially, carefully said in inverted commas, biosimilars to themselves is not generally well known. And so the variation in complex biologics is a burden that's being borne by biosimilars. So this misinformation is not trivial. It's incredibly important. And we have masses of data now from Europe, and I can vouch that Europeans are, broadly speaking, very similar to Americans, right? We have now more than 2 billion patient days of experience from Europe with biosimilars, nothing unusual or unexpected. So I think we need to step forward using that real world evidence, that confidence in clinical use, and create the opportunities then for the savings in the US, but then it gets into the incentive systems. And I would defer to maybe Sonia on how the incentives in the US are not necessarily to use the cheapest medicine.
So you're saying that what we should hit the fast forward button because we have a lot of data out there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The science is kind of 25 years old, if not more, but the incentives to use the cheapest product are absolutely not there. And biosimilars can't be repeatedly launched, induce savings on innovator prices, but not get market share, or we won't have sustainability. And given the US only at 4% of the world's population is about 60% of the biologics market, we're carrying an awful lot as we go into the drug price debate. And I think the expectations for biosimilars saving us in the way that perhaps generics have may be unrealistic, but it's very important to manage these expectations, the economic ones, the science ones, the clinical ones, the legal ones, and create a playing field in which biosimilars can legitimately compete and actually help innovator products, because then they give up room in the healthcare dollar for the next generation of innovator products. This is not a anti-innovator at all. Biosimilars are the best opportunity for greater innovation and access to those next gen products of any situation that I can see.
But aren't there two issues here? And please, Madeline and Sonia, jump in. But it's not just an issue of regulation and data, but there's also federal law that allows for patent challenges, right? And isn't that the reason?
That prevents some of the launches. That doesn't prevent the approvals. And that's where we've got the difference between your 33 approved and your 24 launched, is not in the exclusivity. It's in the patent estates that have led to the licensing. And of course, the real test will be in 2023, when there's the expectation of a slew of adalimumab biosimilars.
Once you're right, Jillian, once the, once we get the pharmacy side, we'll actually probably see even more of the perverse incentive take place. The medical benefits side, I mean, I'll be honest, I look at the prices every day as we order every day, and it varies from month to month. Oftentimes the innovator is the reference product has a lower price. But what happens is the middleman comes in and essentially tells the physician which drugs they can use. This year alone, reference product has been dropped by at least 2 of the major insurers, and that is handled on the medical benefits side. We've yet to actually test the pharmacy side, which has even more perverse incentives to use higher priced drugs. I can give you hundreds of examples where a $10,000 simple molecule drug has a $500 generic, and the preferred drug is the $10,000 simple molecule. So I can't wait for the pharmacy side biosimilars to come on to actually be able to test if the middlemen will actually put a lower price drug on the formulary over a higher price drug.
Before you continue, I'm sorry, Sonia. I just, maybe for the benefit of some folks who may not know as much as you all do about incentives, could you just explain a little bit about what you mean by incentives there? And then back to you, Sonia. My apologies.
No. So on the pharmacy side, there are formularies that are created by the insurance companies, and that's the list of medications that will be paid for. And the incentive, as much as you hear lower cost and higher savings, often the incentive is to have the higher price drug on the formulary because there are rebates and fees based on the list price of the drug. So if a middleman puts a higher price drug on, they'll save more money, but will actually cost the employer and the patient more. It's not as much that way on the medical benefits side, but there are the perverse incentives in terms of if reimbursement is based on the list price of the drug to use a higher price drug. But I can, I'm a rheumatologist, and Infliximab right now is the one that we use. And I will pick the lowest price drug, and often it's the reference product. So we see an ASP change, and it's been amazing. I mean, I've seen a 50%, 100% almost, 50% drop in the price of Infliximab since the biosimilars come out. So it's working. And I think we need to make sure, and I agree with everyone, that we have a very vibrant biosimilar marketplace in order to keep those prices coming down.
It's working except for the biosimilar sponsor, because if they don't get market share, they cannot afford to invest in and introduce more biosimilars. So it's a temporary solution, even as the prices go down. And that's my biggest worry by far, is it's got to be market share to the biosimilar sponsor, or there is no biosimilars business.
Well, this is where we're starting to see this shift where thus far, majority of biosimilar activity has been under the medical benefit. 17 of the 20 on the market officially have oncology indications. So that's where the vast majority is happening. And then we have, of course, the Infliximab biosimilars. But moving forward, exactly to Madeline's point, we're going to be entering this pharmacy benefit space. And in my opinion, what better place than start than insulins, where we just had the first FDA official approval of an interchangeable biosimilar with a long-acting insulin agent. I think this is, in my opinion, going to be a perfect use case to further not only test the implications of interchangeability that everybody's been talking about so long to see whether it does help or really does nothing, but also shed light into these dynamics with the payers, the PBMs, and the, quite frankly, perverse incentives that don't allow accessibility to these high quality, lower cost alternatives. And I'll add that I agree, it's multifaceted, the environment, what's happening today. And that education piece, you need the education, the incentive, the regulatory, all that needs to come together. I mean, just talking about the number of approvals and those on the market, from my count, I would say maybe 31 approvals and 20 officially on the market. And that's because of the regulatory terms and the transitions of insulins to be regulated as biosimilars. You have authorized generics. You have all these different terminologies that get confusing on what are these? How can they be used? Are they all substitutable? Are they not? So I think it's a lot of education is also needed, especially as we transition to this pharmacy benefit space.
The key point there is an interchangeable is not a better biosimilar.
Right.
It's the same product on which additional studies have been done. So and it's only relevant to those products that are Part D and can be substituted by a pharmacist. FDA said years ago, I remember back in 2018 in London, FDA said for the purposes of physician prescribing, every biosimilar they've approved is already interchangeable. So the science and clinical outcome is already assessed and is already just fine. And then it goes to this confidence issue and this perception issue that somehow an interchangeable is a better biosimilar. It's not. It's the same product, which is what we'll see with this first interchangeable insulin. It's the same product that was previously approved as a rollover a year ago and was approved, ironically, as a 351A standalone biologic. So it's a complicated space. But what I would like to the takeaway is the science is rock solid. The science is kind of old and established, but the games that can be played within the various systems, biosimilars have brought down the prices of the originators, but we don't have a sustainable model.
You know, part of the problem is even if an insulin or other biologic is deemed interchangeable, if it is not preferred on the formulary, the pharmacist, even in a state where interchangeability can be substituted, they can substitute it all they want, but the patient will then pay the full list price. The list price might be 30%. So we're talking about very expensive medicines to begin with. So a 20 or even 30% drop off without formulary coverage it ain't going to be used. And pardon my vernacular there, but that's just the bottom line. So interchangeability almost becomes moot. Yes, will it give a little bit more confidence? But I can tell you, in the middlemen have no qualm about dropping a reference product in the middle of the year and substituting a biosimilar. And I think where physicians maybe have a little bit of worry, we could be looking at every 6 months a change in the formulary. Reference starts off for the first 6 months. Then we have biosimilar 3 in the second 6 months. Then we go to biosimilar 2 for the next year, then maybe back to the reference product. And perhaps that is all fine with the drift that we're talking about in terms of the actual antibodies themselves. But it is a little disconcerting when our patients see a different name come up every 6 months. And that is out of the control of the provider. That is under the control of the insurance company and their pharmacy benefit manager.
Here's a question from the audience. Is the biosimilar strategy working for payers if the originators reduce their prices to compete, or only if the biosimilars gain market share?
You've got to have both in the end to have a sustainable market, but short term, any reduction in price works for the payers.
So the price, the amount of rebate, and the market share, and the percent of rebate and the market share are the 3 things that determine the attractiveness, let's say, of the drug to the formulary construction person. And I say this over and over. I don't think we have as much of a drug pricing crisis in the United States as a formulary construction crisis, because I can't choose the drugs that I prescribe. I have to go by the list. And that's why I think it's going to be really important when we see the pharmacy side come out. The whole point behind having a biosimilar is to have a less expensive drug. But if you're less expensive and you have no market share, unless you own a drug that's a blockbuster, that's already has a large rebate being paid to the PBM, you have no chance of getting on the formulary. It's all about the contracting.
And so you could see that almost starting to play out as we get into this Part D space, starting with the insulins. I mean, if you look at the window of opportunity, it's primarily starting with those uninsured, underinsured, cash paying patient, anywhere that you're not bound by the formulary decisions. Because that's exactly the point. I mean, I was spot on with interchangeability. The whole concept and the reason why this was created was to create a more generic-like environment for these biologics. However, to Madeline's point, you could have all the interchangeability in the world. However, if it's not covered or patients can't access it or pharmacies won't be reimbursed for dispensing it, I mean, what weight will that do? So, or what weight will it have? So it's really a big challenge on the way it's just overall the healthcare infrastructure is when it comes to the flow of the dollars and formulary decisions that drive treatment decisions.
And this isn't recent. I think this is the whole point. You can look back and there's examples going all the way through. I mean, I remember way back when in 2006, when the first biosimilar in Europe was Omnitrope, that product happened to be approved in the US as a 505(b)(2) drug, and it's now rolled over. But the point being that the price had to go up for the company to get market share. That is counterintuitive to most rational human beings.
A quick housekeeping point. If you have questions, folks, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, not the chat function. I want to be able to see everything, and I don't want to miss something because it's better to have in one spot. Meanwhile, there's another question from the crowd. How do you believe the coverage gap impacts incentives and thus potentially negatively impacting biosimilars from a payer perspective? If a drug goes through the coverage gap and a payer receives a rebate on those coverage gap claims, they see a financial incentive. With biosimilars not going through the coverage gap, this could create perverse incentives. What do you think of that?
There's more perverse incentives in our drug supply chain, and whether it's Medicare or commercial. When a higher priced drug makes more money for everyone in the drug supply chain, why put a lower priced drug? And in terms of the coverage gap, I maybe I don't understand the question specifically. Sonia, do you follow?
I mean, I'm thinking of an
question?
example, like there's more innovative models like from CMMI, like the senior savings model in Part D that's capping out-of-pocket insulin costs at $35. There's almost like these initiatives that are in place to help, I'll call it somewhat Band-Aid, because so the patients don't feel it. But if you think about it, at the end of the day, even in that type of model, what's the incentive to prefer or utilize a lower cost agent if the patient out of pocket is not going to be any different? So it's like you have one end, you're covering the holes in the boat somewhere, and it's water's coming through another end. So I feel like we have these almost Band-Aid models or even pilots to try to address some of this, but at the root of it all, it's just there's that overall perverse incentive that what's the manufacturer's incentive to come to market with a lower cost alternative? I mean, just plainly put.
If you're not going to be put on the formulary, there's absolutely no incentive whatsoever. I mean, I have recordings of pharmacy techs from some of the biggest PBMs saying we prefer the $10,000 drug over the $500 drug. So when you have that type of a model, I'm amazed and grateful that manufacturers are even trying to come out with a biosimilar. It's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to compare pricing in the US and pricing in Europe, because there isn't the huge middleman that is, to be honest, competition raises prices in the US. It's more like everybody going and buying a house. The more people you have going to buy the house, the higher the bid goes. And that's how you get on the formulary, is by increasing your bid, which is based on the list price or your percent discount or your market share. Unfortunately, it's not the kind of competition that lowers the price, because formulary positioning is not the lowest price drug. It's the highest rebate, or shall we say kickback. Since there is a safe harbor from the anti-kickback statute, the rebates really are kickbacks. They wouldn't need safe harbor if they weren't. And so how do you get your kickback higher? You increase the price of your drug, you increase the percentage discount or rebate that you'll give, or you increase your market share. And if you're a biosimilar, you're starting behind the 8 ball, because your price is lower by definition, hopefully, and your market share is lower because you're newer to the, I just can't wait till the pharmacy side, gets flooded with biosimilars, and we'll actually see how the PBMs handle them.
Yeah, I think all this experience now, we're starting to kind of open the covers on the Part D side with this first experience, but what is everybody watching and waiting for and talking about is 2023. So when you have the top selling drug in the world and of all time, with adalimumab having now potentially up to 10 candidates that are trying to compete in that space. And so I think a lot of this exposure and discussion now is so critical, because it's going to pave the way for even larger molecules and have a potentially bigger impact. We see more and more of these discussions. I mean, looking at the recent HHS report on drug pricing, Jillian has referred to this before. It's a 27-page report. Biosimilars are mentioned over 90 times in that report. This is a top of mind area to help address the rising healthcare costs. And it might be my optimistic view, but I don't see it going anywhere. And quite frankly, I think they're critical to address the costs associated with biologics that are needed at the end of the day for patients that are facing these debilitating and terrible conditions.
The only place you actually see pricing mentioned is on the medical benefits side. If you notice, there is an ASP, and the ASP has come down because of the biosimilars. There is no such thing as an ASP on the pharmacy side. If you notice, it's all proprietary. God forbid the exact rebate amount gets out from one manufacturer to the PBM. They say it'll increase prices. I would submit that that's probably not the case. But if you've got an entire portion of the drug supply chain on the pharmacy side, no one even knowing what the ASP is, how is a biosimilar gonna break into that? Whether physicians like it, whether physicians are educated, whether physicians are worried about it, it almost won't make any difference if they're not available to prescribe.
What's the answer to breaking that?
I say create formularies on the lowest list price, not on the highest kickback. You would think that would be, that's how competition lowers prices. by having compete on lower list prices. And this is not all just a PBM thing. This is a manufacturer problem as well. This gives the manufacturers a very good excuse for raising their list price. I have to raise my list price in order to give the biggest kickback. So there, you know, it's a lot of pots and kettles calling each other black. But if you really want to create competition that lowers the price, then the bidding should, to get onto the formulary should be on the lowest list price. But that would take a lot of the profit out of being a pharmacy benefit manager.
And again,
go ahead.
And I was just saying, again, keeping the patient at the center of it, what is the patient paying off of? It's not the net price. So it's they're exposed to the cost sharing of the list price. So that's where the pain point at the end of the day, again, keeps coming down to what's happening and the burden being placed on the patients who need these treatments.
Yep. And in Part D, it's the exact same thing. The patients pay their cost share, whether it's a co-insurance in commercial or their cost share in Part D on the list price. Let me tell you, if you try to start suggesting that patients pay their cost share on the net price or the post-rebate price, you would think that, you know, the world was ending. Premiums are going to go up. Prices are going to go up. We need to have more transparency in the market so that biosimilars, once they do come to the pharmacy side, everyone will be able to see, well, why is this $10,000 a month drug being used when I could, as an employer, use a $6,000 a month drug? You know, maybe you save $5,000 on the $10,000 a month drug and you only save $3,000. Well, there comes a point when we can't afford $10,000 in savings. I mean, it's a very, very upside down system. But Julian, your point is absolutely right. I think if the market share goes away for the biosimilar manufacturers, the biosimilars are just going to go away.
Well, and we've already seen that. And not to be, I mean, a lot of you know I'm the Black Knight of biosimilars from Monty Python. I've had my arms and legs cut off over the last 25 years, and it's only my head left to go. Because fighting this fight, I've done it from the science, right? The science is asked and answered, but the science, the complexity is used as an excuse to somehow imply this is not doable, but other countries are succeeding. We can manufacture at massively improved titers. We can get that cost of goods down. We can make these products available, but we've also got the artificial barriers to entry that is costing you, 100 to 500 million to get your product to market. The average generic is 1 to 5 million. And then where's your ROI? You can do a cost of goods and sell it, but you've got to get that ROI too. The innovator is already, they've covered their ROI probably 20, 30 years ago. So the issue then becomes, is there a level playing field you can even succeed in? And we've seen major sponsors pull back. And my biggest concern is the US is now such a disproportionate part of the originator market that if the biosimilars can't succeed here, can't penetrate, we see that drug price debate carry on. We see less and less access. And if the biosimilar sponsors can't succeed in the United States, can we even have them worldwide? This is not just a 300 million people question. This is a 7 billion people question on the access and affordability of leveraging around the world this cost of development. So I can make arguments that I think are very compelling, of course, that we can make the biosimilars much more efficiently, much more effectively, have global regulatory reliance, the same as we've learned with COVID, it's the same science worldwide. But if we can't make the US market work, is there a world market for biosimilars given the disproportionate role of the US on the origination side? And so I'm a great proponent of originator biologics, but how far do they go consuming the healthcare dollar if we can't make this work? Because without those biosimilars, the originator prices wouldn't have changed. And it's not that anybody's bad here. It's just if the incentives are misaligned, guess what? You only see the successful companies who've learned how to use the incentives. So if we know we've got these errors in the incentives, we've got to fix those or nothing's going to change.
So I'm seeing some comments and questions to that effect, sort of expressions of angst as part of this. There's a sort of helplessness that I'm detecting, that if we're identifying what can be fixed. What specifically should we be focusing on to make those fixes? Is it something FDA can do by its own? Is it Congress? Is it the employer who should be pushing the insurer in different ways? Because you've all identified some pretty specific issues, but how do we resolve them?
I think it's the commercials got it. I will punt to both my colleagues while they think about it. There's a lot that FDA can do to make the process more efficient, not requiring unnecessary clinical studies. I've published on all this. So there's a lot we can do to be more efficient, quicker, not need the level of investment that is currently expected to get a biosimilar approved by the FDA. But that alone, even if we halve the price of development, halve the time it takes to get there, it's not enough. Over to my colleagues, we have to fix the purchasing system.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, to your comments, Ed, I would check all of the above. I mean, it can't be one tactic alone, from the regulatory efficiency to addressing the knowledge gaps and the misconceptions. I mean, you need to have the clinical confidence to even want to use the biosimilars. And then to the incentive models with the payments and reimbursement and the middlemen and what's going on there. I mean, ultimately, some of these things will likely only come to fruition through policy reform, or as we have more and more of these situations with more biosimilars in the market, raising the awareness and shedding light on the dynamics that is inhibiting the adoption of these products. So I mean, it has to be multifaceted, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't look at this as necessarily an approval problem. Everything that the FDA has done, I think, has encouraged the trust of physicians in the biosimilars. So you get the approval, but then the first big hurdle is the launch. I mean, look at the launch, how long it's going to take for the first, the big blockbuster drug to actually come to market launched. And then once it's launched, it can be launched, but if it's not available through insurance companies, because again, unless the price is cut by, unless it goes down to something that people can pay for with cash, which that will never happen, it has to be on the formulary. I don't care how great the drug is. I don't care how safe the drug is. I don't care how much exactly it's like the innovator. Unless it's on the formulary, nobody's going to take it. And I don't care if all the physicians love it and trust it. If it's not available to write the prescription and have it covered, no one's going to take it. And the United States has a very unique way of formulary construction that's different than the rest of the world. They don't have these large companies that make more money on higher priced drugs. I mean, you can look at the prices on the Medicare dashboard of the medical or the provider administered drugs versus the dashboard of the pharmacy. And the rate of rise of price is much higher on the pharmacy side because there is some benefit to using a lower priced drug on the medical side. So if we are looking for a way to cut prices, it's going to be the pharmacy side that's going to really make the huge difference. But again, I bring up, if a $10,000 small molecule drug is preferred over a generic that only costs $500, patients still can't afford it, a prostate cancer drug, how are we ever going to make them put a biosimilar on? You can apply for an appeal to actually get the biosimilar or to get a generic product, but it'll either be put on a higher tier where it'll cost the patient more. So, that's the other meme. Everyone talks about costs and savings and no one ever talks about price.
Yeah, and I'll add just overall, I think we have to be almost cautious about just generalizing biosimilars in the US. Each therapeutic area and each molecule type has kind of unique considerations. You could look at the adoption rates in oncology and rheumatology, which has to go with some of the differences in the therapeutic nature of what these products are treating. In oncology, you have a more new starts, the opportunity for new indications in oncology. So those providers that may feel more comfortable starting new patients have a bigger window to do so versus in immunology, rheumatology, a lot of chronic long-term treatments, which Madeline could speak much better than I can, where a lot of the discussion is about switching patients to the biosimilars. So each one has unique dynamics. Now we're about to enter ophthalmology, brand new space, and that one's unique in the sense that you don't have the 15 years and over 2 billion patient days of EU experience that Jillian referenced in ophthalmology. This is one of the first FDA approvals for an ophthalmology biosimilar. So the world can essentially be looking to the US and probably EMA that it got approval shortly before the US approval for developing the real world evidence, the data to help equip these providers with developing clinical confidence moving forward. So I always say each therapeutic area is almost going to have its unique considerations, but what we don't want to do is start from scratch each time. I mean, like we've seen the learning curve in oncology in the beginning, and then in rheumatology, ophthalmology. What we want to do is continuously leverage the lessons learned, be proactive in the educational efforts to help prime the market and the stakeholders that are going to be evaluating these products.
Do you think Medicare negotiations would make a difference or enough difference?
I'm sorry, Ed, what was the question?
Allowing Medicare to negotiate?
If negotiations are on lower prices and not necessarily on higher rebates, then lower price drugs would be picked. But there's the rebate system in the Medicare space as well, on the pharmacy side, and the government loses out if the rebates go away. But I would submit, you know, if you have a $10,000 a month drug and the rebate's $5,000, if the price comes down to $5,000 as opposed to 10, but no one's making, you still end up spending only 5,000. And I think that's the better way, because then people would compete on lowest price. Because right now, lowest price and small market share won't buy you much.
But that's also where the cost of development is important, because the time of entry of a biosimilar into the market, they've got to cover the cost of development, whether it's 100 million or 500 million, as well as get a return on cost of goods. The originator has already covered their cost of development, even if it was 1.4 billion, 2.4 billion, whatever number we use right now. So at least temporarily, the originator can always undercut if we don't deal with the cost of development too.
You know, the large closed health systems, take the VA, for example, you know, they picked a biosimilar, and there are a number of closed health systems that do, like countries in Europe and provinces in Canada, pick one biosimilar or reference, depending on the GPO and the rebates, of course. And everyone who practices in that closed health system has to use that. You know, there's fear from rheumatologists from switching from one to another, perhaps not necessarily one switch or even two switches, but because of how the system is, and we know that they do this already with a completely different mechanism of action, that there will be no qualms about switching biosimilar 1 to 6 to 5 to 4.
And actually, there isn't, to that point, with the winner takes all, there's an issue even in Europe. If a single winner takes all, then you've got a problem of sustainability of multiple market entrants. And that's where the UK, to give due deference to my former nationality, has done a very interesting approach, which is to take bids, but keep everybody on the market with their market share proportionate to the savings they offer. So if, say, the top two bidders are the best price, they will get, and it's similar, they'll get broadly similar market share, with the whole goal that you've got to keep multiple products in the market if you're to have choices going forward. If you have single tenders that last, 1 or 2 years and you only buy one product, then you're not going to sustain a market. So I think ideas are emerging as to how to do some of this, but it's with a level of confidence, I think, and a lack of ambiguity as to what they're doing. And we just don't have that in the US. It's just so obtuse what's going on here.
There was one state that had a piece of legislation that would have mandated every single biosimilar plus the reference product be on the formulary. And, there are pros and cons on both of those. If it's mandated to be on the formulary, then there's no impetus to lower the price to get onto the formulary. But if you think about it, there's no impetus to lower the price anyway, because it's not based on lowest price, it's based on highest rebate. So I think perhaps a demonstration project where all biosimilars and the reference product are mandated. And I know, Jillian, that doesn't necessarily answer, the market share issue, but if physicians had a choice to use every single one, and then, let the cards fall where they may. But right now, we don't have that choice.
There was mentioned earlier about 2023 and Humira. I'm wondering what you folks think will occur, and how momentous will that be? What should we expect? How will we know if it proves that the market has potential or not?
Well, already there has been some push by perhaps the manufacturer of the reference product, because they've now made another drug in the rheumatology space that patients can then move to. It's interesting because, having that market share for Humira has allowed their JAK inhibitor, which is a great drug, but it is the most expensive of the three that are out there. And because of that leverage, let's call it, there are other drugs that now have more penetrance on the formulary. So it'll be curious to see how that leverage is, if it's still in place, if you've got 5 or 6 biosimilars. But having that many biosimilars is also, a downside for biosimilar manufacturers, because you're diluting market share by having so many biosimilars in the space as well. Don't you think, Jillian?
Well, they're going to be staged entries, which makes it interesting because they're licensing agreements. So the first one through has a January 31st launch date negotiated as part of their patent licensing agreement. Then there's a bunch mid-year. But a bigger issue, I think, is the life cycle management around the reformulation, and that none of the biosimilars will have a matching formulation to the version of the reference to which most patients have been converted. And I never really believed in evergreening of innovative products insofar as I thought it was, improved products, and that's fine. You want to induce innovation, BPCIA, the statute, the I is for innovation, right? But then to see these changes in formulation on the originators done using comparability, which by definition do not change clinical outcome, but then used to, be a justification for somehow there's a problem with medical switching, when right now the originator is switching from the old to the new formulation. There's a lot of, I think, life cycle management initiatives we have yet to see fully play out. So the Black Knight is not sanguine that it's going to pan out as people expect in 2023.
Well, you have all these different considerations with that product. From concentration differences, citrate, needle size, latex free, there's a lot of different elements to this product that's making it dynamic. And currently, to Jillian's point, the 6 FDA approved are for the regular standard concentration. However, there's candidates in development that are trying to have the high concentration version that are seeking approval around the same time. So you have all of this different competition trying to come in. And then to Madeline's point, innovator continues innovating, which is what we want to see in healthcare because of the entrance of biosimilars too, of shifting patients to some of these newer novel treatment options too. So I think it's going to be a very eventful year, to say the least.
I know we'd like to think that perhaps Federal Trade Commission, could look at some behaviors as anti-competitive, and not necessarily always on the manufacturer side. There's anti-competitive behaviors from the formulary constructors, essentially making competition raise the prices. So the problem is when it comes to regulating those companies, I haven't noticed any headway with the Federal Trade Commission. Perhaps it will take an act of Congress, but if you looked at the most recent drug pricing edict out there, there is no mention of middlemen. There's no mention of higher prices being preferred. in spite of the fact that when I testified before the Health Subcommittee for Energy and Commerce, the representative from PCMA, which is the Pharmacy Benefit Manager Trade Group, stated, well, yes, we do put higher priced drugs on the formulary. And there was like a big yawn. I mean, don't call that there's a drug pricing crisis when innate in the system prefers higher priced drugs, whether it's on the medical benefit side, where there is an incentive to use a higher priced drug if you're paid on the list price, but where we see the bulk of it is in the formulary construction on the pharmacy side. And so we've got all the new innovations, the evergreening, we've got the blockage of getting onto the formulary. So Jillian, maybe your sanguinity is warranted.
And the thing is that the science is cumulative. I mean, the pipeline, the promise, what we've seen with COVID is so tremendous. But if there's no room in the healthcare dollar for this next generation of innovation, then nobody gets access to it. So what's even worse than what's happening right now is that it freezes the system. It clogs up the system so that nobody does get access. And I like to say that, you know, the saving money aspiration is great, but we have to realistically say, you save money because somebody currently receiving money doesn't get it. And you can imagine that there's not many volunteers for not receiving what they're currently receiving. And so I sort of see it as almost amoral. It's not immoral, it's the nature of the system that we've created that if we don't change, going back to Einstein or whatever, we're going to get exactly the same result. The results won't change if we don't recognize that our system, to Madeline's point, has been created to make this happen. And so without judgment, we have to look at it and say, well, what system do we want to have when broader access seems to me, my naivety and my etiology being apparent, broader access seems to me a good idea. But that's not what our current system is set up on. It's not a healthcare system. It's a series of industries.
Do you think if there were legislation mandating innovators and biosimilars on all formularies, perhaps once the pharmacy side comes through, do you think that would be helpful, or do you think it actually
probably a sledgehammer to break a nut, right? I would prefer that we actually had competition, that we allowed each biosimilar to pursue various levels of indications, presentations, and actually compete essentially on label value. I mean, all these ideas around importation and reference pricing, and I mean, they're all so cumbersome. America's supposed to be about competition, right? How can we have competition in genes and not in drugs?
I can tell you, it goes to the P&T committees of every single insurance company, and they all say, yes, this is a good drug. This is a good drug. This one actually maybe has more value, although they don't really go into the value side so much. And then when it leaves the P&T committee, it goes to contracting.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if one has a higher secondary endpoint in the studies. If it's a lower price, consequently a lower rebate, and it's a smaller market share, contracting is going to put the higher priced, higher market share drug on there.
But my trouble with mandating everything is inventory management could become a nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. And that was more of a rhetorical question, because there's definitely good and bad. Part of the problem is as a physician that administers these biosimilars, I may have a different reference or biosimilar for Infliximab mandated by 3 or 4 different insurance companies. So I have to have all of those in inventory. Right. And if a patient gets sick or they can't use the biologic anymore, I can't use that one for another patient. It's the same as negative side for white bagging, where it's sent from the pharmacy. We can't just interchange all of these because the insurance company won't pay. If they'll only pay for Avsola and all I have is Renflexis or Remicade, I can't infuse it. So it's a very complicated system. But
we've got to aspire to do better. There's no question. We have to put all our brains together and work this out. And I want to see that next generation of innovation, and I want to see biosimilars, because we can make these products more efficiently, reduce cost of goods, and make them more available. And this is happening sort of around the world, but with the last man standing, I think, on the innovation in a lot of areas. And that's important to support too.
Well, yeah.
With that,
No, I was going to just end on my perspective on the optimistic view that I have here is that, I mean, we've already started to see savings, meaningful savings, and impact of biosimilars in the market. Over 7 billion of the 20 billion addressable market has already been realized from the entrance of biosimilars. And what we want to see is continued impact from these agents, enhanced accessibility and affordability to these critical treatments, continued innovation. We see more now than ever, in my opinion, for these biologics that are facing biosimilar competition with dual administration forms, novel administration forms. You look at novel mechanisms of actions. This is all the good that we're seeing as a result of having increased competition. And I think that we just need to focus on the efforts to be supportive and enable access to these treatments.
And I'll just finish by saying we need to figure out a way to make lower priced drugs more attractive to the formulary makers.
All right. Well, we've run over it. That last thought, we've got to wrap up. I want to thank our featured speakers very much. It was a really interesting conversation. And I also want to thank our sponsors, Samsung Bioepis, and to all of you who joined us today, Madeline, Sonia, Jillian, again, thank you. It's great to have you here. To all of you out there, thanks for asking some great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them. It's a very fast-paced conversation, as you saw. If you're interested in learning more, though, about biosimilars, I actually wrote a stat report on the topic featuring the history of the development of biosimilars and an analysis of the roadblocks currently facing the market. You can find that. It's called Biosimilars. What will it take to deliver on their promise? You can find that on our website, and there's more info about the post-event email you'll be receiving later. Heads up, our next virtual event, CAR T Comes of Age, will be taking place Thursday, October 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stats Adam Feuerstein will sit down with a group of experts to look ahead at how new clinical trials that are about to report out could change how CAR T is used. More info and registration details to join us can be found on our website. Until then, thanks again. It was great having all of you on the panel. Thanks again for everyone in the audience for showing up. Stay safe, be well, and see you again.
Thank you.